am going to have an opening statement here, and let me just say that my good friend Senator Boxer and I, the last time we had a major bill on the floor, we were in agreement with each other having to do with the Water Resources Development Act, and prior to that, the Transportation Reauthorization. On this, we very much disagree, and she has every right to be wrong. I would like to also mention, since she commented about the possibility that the cloture vote might be tough, I don't think it will be, because there are a lot of people who very much oppose this legislation who are going to vote for cloture, including some of the leadership on our side that is opposed to this bill. And although the vast majority of the scientists do not believe that man-made gases, and we're talking about anthropogenic gases, CO2, methane, are a major contributor to climate change, that is not a part of the debate of the Lieberman-Warner bill. And if it were, it would take a lot more time than we're going to be able to devote. So we're not going to discuss that. That's for another day. As we begin the debate today, the climate legislation, I want to make just a few points. I'd first like to discuss what we as Republicans stand for, then talk briefly about the process of how we got to the debate and how we got the debate on the floor today. Then finally discuss how we would like to see the floor debate progress over the coming days, or perhaps the coming weeks, as some believe it might be. First and foremost, we as Republicans believe any legislation that attempts to address climate change must protect American families and must protect U.S. workers, and has to maintain global fairness, and finally offer clean energy solutions. Unfortunately, this bill and the Climate Security Act of 2008, which is, my understanding, what it's called now, since this has been an amendment or a substitute that we're considering, fails on all of these counts. We believe that any climate legislation must offer clean energy solutions. Substantial investment must be made in new clean energy technologies which would generate more energy efficiently by producing less carbon without the government picking winners and losers. It makes good business sense to produce energy more efficiently, and American companies are at the forefront of developing these new technologies. Now, we support investments in solar, wind, hydro, geothermal, and other innovative technologies, but we must be careful not to interfere in the free market system, or we might stifle new innovations. Any approach that addresses climate change must incorporate more emission-free nuclear power. We are on the verge of a nuclear renaissance in this country, and it is key to our long-term domestic energy independence. We got to address the remaining issues that hinder the construction of new nuclear plants, such as loan guarantees, waste and regulatory certainty. Senator Domenici, the greatest champion of the nuclear industry has ever had, is retiring at the end of this year, and I can think of no greater honor to him than to make his renaissance a reality, the renaissance of nuclear energy. Coal is our most abundant domestic energy source, and it must be a part of any solution. We must invest in clean coal technologies in order to increase our energy security. And while we are continuing to explore carbon capture and storage, we cannot hold the future use of coal hostage to this one technological feat. Senator Byrd has been a tireless advocate for greater use of coal, and I know Senator Voinovich and Senator Barrasso on the committee have been championing its use. We need to promote natural gas. Increasing supplies of natural gas are needed in order to compensate for fuel switching, which could harm America's industrial base and export jobs. We know that fuel switching actually is taking place right now. We have an almost limitless supply of natural gas available, and we have proven that we can develop this important resource in an environmentally friendly way. I'd like to see us build up upon Senator Warner's past work and open up more of the offshore resources, which would be absolutely necessary for us to capture this natural gas. We must seriously consider how climate legislation will impact economic competitiveness. Emissions are a global issue which should be addressed globally, not unilaterally. All major emitting countries, including developing nations, must participate in order for any U.S. program to produce meaningful reductions in atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases. Today, China emits more carbon dioxide than we do, and that divide is only going to grow, because 2 years ago we produced more than they did. And China, I think we know, they're increasing their number of coal-fired generating plants by 2 each week. Now, the Kyoto Treaty expires next year, and any future treaties should include the developing nations. Any action has got to provide real protections for the American economy and jobs. American jobs should not go overseas where environmental laws are less strict and emissions increase. If the United States were to act unilaterally, manufacturing facilities will go overseas. They got to go where the energy is. We know that. And that's where the energy regulations or emission regulations are more laxed. This will result in more emissions at the industrial source and more emissions in transporting the products back to the United States. Let me just repeat that. In the event that we acted unilaterally and we had a cap and trade system that ended up in reducing the amount of emissions of CO2, then these companies that would be the losers in this program would be merely moving to China or India or down to Mexico. And there they don't have any emission requirements. So it would actually have the effect of increasing the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. Any action has got to provide real protections for the American economy and jobs, and we must protect the American families. Any action should not raise the cost of gasoline or energy to American families, particularly in low income and elderly who are most susceptible to energy costs. Those who make $20,000 a year spend 1/3 or more of their income on energy. And we can't turn our backs on the less fortunate people. We've got to carefully consider the policy tools used to enact any climate legislation. Any solution must not include slush funds controlled by federal bureaucracies used to reward political friends. The climate solution should not require an overhaul of our economy, and those decisions should not be made by nameless bureaucrats rewarding their friends or pet projects. Senator Corker has examined this legislation carefully and has outlined over 45 new programs created by this bill. Let me repeat that. The Wall Street Journal has said last week, it said this bill would impose, quote, this bill would impose the most extensive government reorganization of the American economy since the 1930s. Now, we can't afford any tax increases, either directly or indirectly. We must recognize that true innovation comes from the private sector. This bill will raise over $6.7 trillion from carbon sales and auctions, primarily coming from consumers. In other words, consumers are going to be paying the $6.7 trillion. Now, but it does direct $2.45 trillion back to consumers. So if all the transition assistance funds go directly to consumers without the businesses or states keeping any of the funds to run their transition programs, which they are allowed to do, this means that over $4.2 trillion will be used to fund new government programs. $4.2 trillion. The senator from California referred twice in her opening remarks to Senator Gregg in complimenting him and saying that he believes the only difference between the two of them is he'd like to send this back to the taxpayers rather than to have $4.2 trillion of new bureaucracies in this country. And I agree with that. Any solution's got to be national in scope without states or regions imposing duplicative or additional requirements on top of a federal system. It will be impossible for American industry to remain competitive if different regions or states have additional climate programs on top of a federal program. And finally, any national program must contain a transparent, effective cost control mechanism to avoid harm to the economy and job losses. There are many ideas out there which might work, including the ideas from Senators Bingaman and Specter. Senator Specter, who just spoke, simply borrowing credits from future years will only create a larger problem later on. Now, how we got here. Unfortunately, the bill we are discussing today violates all of these principles. It ignores the needs of American families. It jeopardizes the jobs of American workers. It does not offer a global solution, and in fact will increase global emissions. And it does not promote good, clean energy solutions, and in fact will make us even more dependent upon foreign sources of energy. One of the chief problems with this legislation is that it works hastily. It was hastily considered by the Environment and Public Works Committee without the benefit of the appropriate legislative process, and a new version is now being considered on the Senate floor that we've had no hearings on whatsoever. The chairman of the Environment Committee has stated, and you're going to hear again and again and again today and the next few days and maybe the next few weeks, that the committee held over 20 hearings last year before proceeding to a substitute and a full committee markup. However, you must take a look at the type of hearings that we held. Most of the hearings examined the potential impact of climate change 50 years in the future. My favorite example was a hearing held on May 24th last year. The issue, quote, the issue of the potential impacts of global warming on recreation and recreation industry. Now, that was the name of the hearing. The apparent point of this hearing was to show that if there's no snow in 50 years, that the skiing industry might suffer. Well, I think that's probably reasonable, and I think it would. But the thing is, that didn't really address a cap-and-trade system that we needed to study before coming to the floor. Unfortunately, the list of issues unaddressed by this committee is longer than the actual list of hearings the chairman did hold. These topics, which were never explored by the committee prior to drafting the legislation, include how to draft a cap-and-trade system, how do you do it, how to allocate credits, how to design an auction system, how many credits to assign each industrial sector, how to structure a carbon market efficiency board, how to create a domestic offset program, what to do with international offsets, what the impacts would be on fuel switching, whether carbon capture or storage technologies will be available by 2030, whether the number of nuclear power plants can be built in time to provide the necessary electricity, how the impact on the natural gas supply will affect other industries, how many jobs will be sent overseas, how much worldwide emissions will increase when U.S. jobs will be sent overseas, what the international provisions impacts will be on trade, and particularly exports, how to effectively contain costs through a transparent mechanism, and the list goes on and on and on. Now, contrast this committee process with the process currently underway in the House Committee on Energy and Commerce. Chairman Dingell's committee, which has jurisdiction over climate change and environmental issues in the House, is pursuing the issue under a much more methodical and deliberative process, as any legislation of this magnitude demands. Acknowledging the complexity of the issues surrounding any mandatory greenhouse gas reduction policy, the committee has held a series of hearings and has released several white papers. The topics have included the fundamental aspects of greenhouse gas cap and trade policy, including the point of regulation and the benefits of auction versus allocation schemes, the interaction of climate change policy with other environmental law like the Clean Air Act, the Endangered Species Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, state and federal preemptive issues, international competitiveness, and how to engage the developing world in technology barriers. These are only threshold issues as one lends itself to further examination. Now, that's what's been done over in the House of Representatives and Chairman Dingell's committee. And he's made a lot of progress over there and some things we should pay attention to. In fact, we plan to be using some of that on the floor here. While the subcommittee did hold one legislative hearing prior to the markup, and the full committee held 3 such hearings over a 2-week period before the full committee markup, all of these hearings were held without the benefit of any economic or environmental analysis. The committee members had no idea what the impacts of this legislation would be when we considered the bill in December. We offered a number of amendments to protect workers, families, and try to keep a check on energy prices. Almost all of them were defeated. But we were promised that our issues would be addressed before the bill reaches the Senate floor. Well, that was last December. On May the 20th, less than 2 weeks ago, the committee bill and report was finally filed after a more than 5-month delay. For a bill of this magnitude, and I remind my colleagues how the Wall Street Journal characterized it. I'll repeat again. This bill would impose the most extensive government reorganization of the American economy since the 1930s, unquote. Only allowing senators to review the report for less than 2 weeks is highly troubling. Even more troubling is the same week we all saw for the first time two more versions of the same bill. Later on May 20th, a new version of the bill with a never-before-seen amendment was filed and held at the desk as a new bill, S3036, which is actually a version that we will be voting on this evening. Then finally on Friday, the May 23rd, a manager's substitute which completely rewrote the legislation was circulated to members. I can only assume that once cloture is invoked, and it will be invoked, that we'll begin debating this bill, that the substitute will be offered, which is, of course, something that's never been subject of hearings, economic analysis, or environmental benefit tests. Now, since the markup last December, we've had numerous economic modeling and analysis conducted by the EPA, the Energy Information Agencies, and multiple private sector analysis. Unfortunately, the Committee of Jurisdiction, the Environment Public Works Committee, never bothered to hold a single hearing on any of these economic reports. I would like to report out that the Senate Energy and Natural Resources held an economic hearing on our bill 2 weeks ago, and I applaud Chairman Bingaman for holding that important hearing. I will be quoting from that hearing that was the Energy and Natural Resources Committee several times during the course of this debate. So where are we today? We spent months holding impact hearings and then rushed through a few quickly scheduled legislative hearings, hold a markup without any analysis of the bill, and then waited for over 5 months before receiving yet two more drafts of the bill. The last version, a mere 10 days ago. The Senate is now being asked to vote for cloture on a motion to proceed to a bill that was released 2 weeks ago. Although I believe we really need to debate these issues on the Senate floor, and many of the members who opposed the Lieberman-Warner bill are voting to proceed to it, I find it most difficult to vote to proceed to the largest tax increase in the history of America. The mechanics of this bill, the impacts, the costs have never been fully debated, and they deserve to be. Proponents of this legislation have talked about how important this bill is and why we need to act. I believe this warrants full debate. In 1990, the Senate spent over 5 weeks debating the Clean Air Act amendments. I was serving in the House at that time. It went on and on and on. This bill goes much further than the Clean Air Act amendments on the American economy and its impact on jobs and its impact on our international competitiveness. It'll do more to direct our energy policy for the next 50 years than either the Energy Bill of 2007 or the Energy Bill of 2005 combined. I hope the majority intends to provide enough time to fully debate this legislation and doesn't plan to rush it on and off the floor in an attempt to check a box. Over the next few days, you'll see a number of Republican amendments, which I believe will get bipartisan support, which will attempt to protect our worker, our families, and our international competitiveness, and will promote clean energy solutions. There have been many comments in the press, particularly from the chairman of the committee, that this bill will be pulled if any so-called weakening amendments are adopted. And I would hope that we will have a constructive and open debate on this bill, and there will be many amendments offered, and I hope debated and voted upon. This bill is the largest bill we'll consider this Congress. In fact, it's probably the largest bill ever considered by the United States Senate in its impact on the economy and our entire way of life, and I hope the majority will give it the time it deserves. But 2 weeks from now, or whenever that vote does take place, keep in mind tonight's vote at 5:30 is only a cloture vote on a motion to proceed. It's a procedural vote. But it allows us to go in there and limit debate on the bill. But whenever the real vote comes, or however long it takes to reach the final vote, it will be both interesting and informative to see how many members of the United States Senate vote for the largest tax increase in the history of America. Now, we'll be talking about a number of things during the course of this debate. Some of this will be tonight, some of it will be over the next few days. And we are anxious to do that. And for our purposes today, we will be allocating time. And I would like to announce that after the time that is already under unanimous consent to go to Senators Lieberman and Warner, that we will start going back and forth. I will be controlling the time of those who oppose the bill, and Senator Boxer will be, or Senator Lieberman will be handling the time of those who support. I yield the floor.